3 years after a national racial reckoning following George Floyd's death, Americans, particularly religious groups, remain divided on issues of race and discrimination. Pew Research Center data shows that white Christians, including evangelicals, Catholics, and mainline Protestants, are more likely to believe that claims of non-existent racial discrimination are a bigger problem than overlooking existing racism. In contrast, Black Protestants, non Christian religious Americans, unaffiliated individuals, and Hispanic Catholics believe that not recognizing racism when it exists is the larger issue. These divides reflect the ongoing polarization within American Christianity regarding systemic racism. Experts suggest that politics often shape these attitudes more than religious beliefs, and addressing these divisions may require a more spiritual approach. Multi ethnic churches and leadership that promote racial reconciliation can play a role in bridging these divides. This story is from Religious News, published on August 28th, 2023. Aaron, what are your thoughts?
This is a really fascinating article. First of all, the stats they share are pretty eye-opening. The 88% of Black Americans, that's 9 out of every 10 Black Americans, 58% of Hispanic Americans, and 66% of Asian Americans are all saying that the bigger problem is not seeing racism where it exists. That's a lot of people. And the fact that on the other side, people that don't experience racism are saying, no, there's no racism. The bigger problem is you think there's racism. I don't think so. When 9 out of 10 Black people tell me that there's racism and there's problems, you should probably listen to those 9 out of 10 people, right? And I don't understand what people's avoidance of talking about it and trying to solve it is. What harm is that going to do to you? How's that going to hurt your life? It's only going to make it better, because if you make life better for one group of people, it's going to make it better for everybody else. One of the examples I like to bring out for making something better for one group and it makes it better for everybody is the American with Disabilities Act. One of its requirements was wheelchair accessibility. So when you go to an intersection with a sidewalk in the U.S., you have to have cutouts, right? You have to have those ramps so wheelchairs can get down to the street and back up onto the sidewalk. When you're in buildings that have stairs, there needs to be ramps for people so that wheelchairs can get to other floors of the buildings. And that's awesome. And you know who else it's awesome for? People that are maybe temporarily in wheelchairs or who are on crutches or who have other temporary health problems. They benefit too. What's that? Cyclists, people on bikes. It helps, and it can help in ways that you don't even intend or see. When you help solve racism so that more people can get into housing, when you solve racism so that less people are going to prison, it's gonna make it better for all other groups of people. I just think there's nothing wrong with trying to find and address racism. I don't see the problem. Jimmy?
I think the obvious answer here is that the failure to address racism that already exists is much more of a problem than attempting to address racism that isn't there. On the one hand, you're avoiding a problem that has plagued our society since its inception. And on the other hand, you're attempting to curtail that problem that has plagued our society since its inception. I think it's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of white people. I can say that as a professional white person myself. Many of us are inherently racist. I heard somebody say that at a conference recently that I attended, and we discussed racism. And I thought it was a pretty good point. You know, just having to look inside ourselves and recognize the system that we grew up in, the way that it oppresses other people, it also, I think, in an exact reciprocation, makes people into the oppressor. And so you have to kind of go overboard when it comes to correcting that. And sometimes the racism just might not be there, but it doesn't make you wrong for trying to look for it. And this really isn't only a white problem, though. I think we all have biases and stereotypes that we employ. And many of us just need to look inside, acknowledge that we do have a certain level of racism. However, white people probably do need to be a little bit more sensitive with their thoughts, their words, and actions, given the history that we've inherited. And I'm not surprised at all that out of all of those surveyed for this article, that the white people that were surveyed really were out of touch with the levels of racism that exist. And that those that are not white well, they experienced it more than the white people. And so that's no surprise to me. And I think it just speaks to the fact that racism and I think equality and justice in society is so lopsided towards one group. And, Phoebe, actually, it reminds me of a segment that we did a few weeks ago where we were talking about a kind of a racist policy that was taking place in a district in California, and it involved Southeast Asians. And, that district in California, 66% Asian and Southeast Asian. The entire state of California, 13% Asian. And so it's no wonder that these racial problems are taking place, and that these people that make up the large portion of that, that specific race's population are the ones that can attest to it best. But our entire legal system is founded on principles devised by men who raped their slaves, and so none of this surprises me, and I'm of the mindset that we do have to keep looking for racism to correct it.
But you raise an interesting point, and I think I raised in the discussion we were having about California something Brigham D. Hunter said. And as a Brit, it resonates very well with me. He said, America does racism like an amateur. It does it against people who look different to one another. Mm-hmm. Britain's gone pro. It does it against people who look the same as you. I mean, just as a context for this, in Britain, white-on-white racism is a thing. There is a lot of discrimination and racism based in and amongst ethnically Anglo-Saxon white people against ethnically white Irish traveling communities. Both white, but the racism and the stereotypes are up the wazoo from the white English towards the white traveler community. But I feel like I'm stating the obvious here, reading these statistics. I mean, I don't mean to sound surprised that a stereotype has been proven here, but it's nice to have statistics to say that the stereotype's been proven here. Shock horror, white people who sit there watching Fox News, listening that they are all going to, die from, mythical white genocide. I will believe that racism is, some non-existent flash in the pan. And, I mean, what kind of thing were we expecting when they did this? Were they expecting, shock results that white people who sit in front of Fox News all day and listen to a pastor that shouts fire and brimstone about how white people come and are the greatest thing since sliced bread with white Jesus and all this, that, and the other, are going to say, well, there's no such thing as racism because I'm all right, Jack. I'm all right, Jack. I mean, I feel like I'm sitting here looking at the most obvious of obvious things I've ever sat and seen. Yeah. I mean, a racial minority who is a victim of racism is going to say that actual racism is a real thing, whereas a racial majority who doesn't actually experience racism is going to say that racism isn't a thing. I mean, we now have statistics on it. I mean, Blatant, I hate to say it, as the resident non-white person on this panel.
I'm professionally black.
And I'm professionally Jewish, so...
I'd look at this and I think it has to be the result of just the whole no truth Scotsman stuff. There's no other way that the Black Protestants, non-Christian religious Americans, unaffiliated individuals, Hispanic, all these groups, there's no way, but thankfully they're in the majority here, but no way that they can believe along the same lines as a group of people whose beliefs are antithetical to their existence outside of religion. You can agree on the religious part, but everything outside of that is just polar opposite. And I know the workaround with that is the no truth Scotsman. They're not real Christians. You know what I mean? That anybody that was raised Christian like I was, we know that's the workaround. That's how you get your head wrapped around these weird relationships. But me personally, I remember when George Floyd died. I remember the feeling in the pit of my stomach when I watched him take his last breath. And there are humans that live amongst us that watch that, and their first thought was, we don't know the whole story. There were adults that woke up the next day and they were posting memes of a man being murdered with the caption, "Can't do the time, don't do the crime."
can't do the fake dollar bill and the traffic ticket. So therefore, you should, pay with your life. I mean, I've made my the death penalty clear, but even I think that's ridiculous. I think any person would think that was ridiculous.
You would think, but like even with that said, ignoring the irony in that statement, because if he had been given the time instead of being murdered, we would have never known about it. There would have been no national outcry. It just would have been someone who went to prison for committing a crime. That happens every day, and nobody cares. The problem with someone's life being stolen for a crime that was so petty that it could have been resolved with change left over from lunch. Those same people are later seen, like recently, celebrating, we'll just say, pro-life issues. So you can watch someone be murdered over a counterfeit $20 bill and celebrate that, but in the same breath celebrate pro-life issues. Does that make sense? But I can't expect people who have that sort of reaction to a tragedy and that sort of train of thought to see anything that doesn't directly impact their lives to care about racism. And you have to think about like what the people in these communities are usually spoon-fed on a daily basis. It's usually some right-wing propagandist confirming their bias and their fear based on opinions. And of course, they think that people imagining made-up racism is the real issue here, because that's what they're being repeatedly told, that they're the real victim. And that's what it does to the brain. Like, we're dealing with the population of people that believe that being replaced and their rights are being threatened every time someone who doesn't look like them or think like them or believe like them or believe in the same psycho sky wizard, every time one of them gains rights, you lose rights. But these people, again, are missing the irony in saying that there's no racism or privilege for certain groups because their fear of people gaining equal rights is apparent. If you fear equality, that means you recognize that you have an advantage to be protected. That's all I've got to say on that.
I have an addition. I have an addition to that. So the point about the memes struck me. It wasn't just memes that people were doing or creating. People would go out and openly let everybody else around them know what their stance was, particularly on this issue. And so not so proudly, but around the same time that this happened, I ended up moving to Florida. And while I was living in Florida, a lot of people tried to figure me out, tried to figure out if I was one of them, or if I was somebody else. And so they'd have to bring up this issue. Meanwhile, I don't even know them. I wouldn't even ask them to get my mail. And they want to talk to me about how they feel about George Floyd. This happened repeatedly. And exactly. And you know what? Those memes were a litmus test as well, because I think that those people wanted to see what kind of responses they got, to see who their people were,
Who was
and
the in crowd?
What? Pardon me?
Who was on their in crowd?
Yeah, right. Exactly. And to see, maybe they're not the only ones, and I could kind of relate because we do it as atheists. I want to know who the other atheists are, right? When everybody's at a work function or something and everybody's got their head kind of bowed and they're all doing their prayer, me and the other atheists are looking around like, oh, hey, those are my folks. But in reality, this is, it's kind of an ugly thing, because all that to say, I think that people really do recognize the level of racism, even if they want to deny it. And as a white person, I don't like having the history that I have. I don't like what my ancestors did. I don't know if my ancestors actually did any of that, my particular bloodline, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. I have benefited from the society that they created because of how I look. I will say I'm the only bald guy on this panel, so I do experience some things that you all don't.
Blatant is trying. Blatant is trying.
You can go read the YouTube comments if you want to see how many people call me the bald guy. Okay, but I'm sorry, I'm adding a little bit of humor to this. It's not funny, but I do think that people are not willing to recognize how much racism there actually is, and I think they know more than they let on.
But I've got something. I worked with someone once. He was an English barrister. He was an English barrister, and he said the following: "I don't see race, even though I'm a black man. It's just a way of creating divides amongst people for the sake of it. Yes, okay, this colleague of mine liked to indulge in the South American marching powder. But what do people think of his sentiment as that coming from a non-white person?" Aaron.
I mean, I think I enjoy the sentiment behind it, but it's not reflective of how the world really works. I'm glad you don't see color. Unfortunately, a large majority of the people do see color, and they behave accordingly, and they vote accordingly, and they treat other people that way. So when we can get to a point in our country where we value character over skin color, where we seek out honest and good people and kind people, where we value those things, and we don't support people that are being dishonest and crooked and just seeking power, then maybe you can have a leg to stand on where you don't see color. But I'm glad that you personally might not see color, but you still need to recognize that there are a lot of people in this country that do, and we have some work to do to combat that.
But I mean, what do you think of his sentiment, though? What do you think of his sentiment, though? That it's just a artificial dividing line that we decide that we're going to divide people upon.
Well, I agree. I think it is artificial, but we have all sorts of artificial dividing lines that we just create. We have religion is artificial dividing lines. You mentioned earlier about the traveling folk in England versus Anglo-Saxon non-traveling folk in England. That's an arbitrary dividing line. You know, Protestant versus non-Protestants. That's a dividing line. We're very tribal, and when
Northern
we
Ireland
identify
is a
our
good example of that,
and
Northern Ireland.
And when we find our tribe, we will do almost anything to protect that tribe. And I would like our tribes to be character, who we are, who we are, how we behave, how we treat people. Those should be the tribes that we gather around.
So it always struck me whenever he used to say it, because he would say it with irony missing from what he was saying, but it would always come across as ironic. But he would also quite casually make the same jokes that you would expect a racist white person to make about, other races. Mm-hmm. It's like, I won't repeat any of them here, but it's just seeing it from a different perspective, because as someone who has usually only seen it from it being a one-way street, in this case, it's always struck me as slightly odd. And has anyone else, Blatant, Jimmy, have you ever encountered someone who has been that kind of an individual?
Oh, yeah. I know plenty of black people that honestly don't like black people. That's the first thing. But even along those lines of, I don't see color, we're all one, like, cool. Go tell that to the cop that just choked somebody out. Cool. Go tell that to the politician that's making laws based upon race. Cool. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I get the sentiment. It's beautiful. Everybody's farting rainbows. It's lovely. Awesome. I get that. But that doesn't reflect reality. So once that becomes the reality, then we can have a conversation. But until then, you are living in an alternative fact world. So
I have my opinion on the whole I don't see color thing, and I do appreciate the sentiment. I have a trouble believing that something like that can actually be true. I think we all do it, right? I do, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it if you're not, unless you're not willing to overcome it, unless you're not willing to recognize it and fight past your own biases. That's where the problem comes in, right? I just think kind of it's just an informational thing. We kind of just create these characters. We create these personalities and people in our heads the way that we think they are. And we have to, when that happens, recognize, I did it again, and move on past it, and kind of just give others the benefit of the doubt. But to say that you are incapable of that happening to you, I think is a little bit disingenuous.
But what I would say is I think we farted enough rainbows on this topic. And if you want to see more, click here.